this morning, as we progress through Deuteronomy, we are going to be covering chapters 5 through 11, which means if you have lunch plans, just plan on being late. We have quite a bit of ground. Here's a question to think on as you turn there. We hear about people, maybe it's a politician who's caught up in a scandal, or there's a headline from somebody, maybe it's someone you know who chooses the wrong, and they choose to trade all the good for it. And we sit there, and in that moment, most of us think, I wouldn't have made that choice. No, that would never be me. If I came to that fork in the road, if I came to that crossroads, I wouldn't choose to go that way. I wouldn't choose that sin. I wouldn't choose that temptation. I wouldn't choose to go down that path. I would choose the right thing. I wouldn't choose the death. I would choose the life. But here's a question. Would you really? Would you actually? Because there's several crossroads in your past. You didn't choose the right one. If you had the choice, if you had the options, would you choose life even though death may seem so much more enticing of a choice? I want to think through that as this morning we ponder and we realize, and I hope it washes over us, that God has made a way for his people to choose life. To choose life. I hope that sinks in, and I hope that it changes both you and I. So let me kick us off here, starting in Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 5. Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain. At that time I stood between the Lord and you to declare to you the word of the Lord, because you were afraid of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. And he said," so here Moses is about to kick off, and he's going to quote God speaking to them, telling them the 10 Commandments. He's saying, listen, remember we were there, and God gave us these commandments. He gave us what we needed to know the ethical, correct way to live in his life, in his world. And it was clear to them what God meant by that. And it was clear to God when they said, we're going to do it. We're going to follow. It's interesting, actually, if you take these 10 Commandments and you overlay them back to the passage in Exodus, there's only one slight difference. In this passage, when he talks about Sabbath, God gives a reason for the Sabbath that's slightly different than what he gave in Exodus. In Exodus, God said, I created the world and I rested on the seventh day, and rest is a part of this design. Rest is important and it's purposeful. And then here, what he does is he builds on that same foundational truth, but he applies it just slightly different. He says, I'm giving you the Sabbath so you remember that you're not slaves. And think about that for a minute, because if you are attached to something, let's say, work, and you're unable to rest from it, you're a slave, right? I mean, that's the background they came from, was they couldn't rest. They were not allowed. And you may be saying, well, no, it's just it's my choice. I'm choosing to do it. Okay, you're choosing to be enslaved to it. That's fine, whatever. That's not really a major part of the sermon. I just felt like putting it in there. All right. God gives them these 10 Commandments. And they say, yes, we'll do them. We'll stick to them, God. And God, in his all-knowing self, says this. Verse 29 of chapter 5, he says, if only it would really be their desire to fear me and obey all my commandments in the future, so that it may go well with them and their descendants forever. They cry out, yes, God, we're going to do it. Well, I promise. And he says, if only it really was your heart. If only inside, in your being, it truly was your desire to honor me as God. then what would happen? Then he would bless us. Right? Then we would be able to interact with him in a way of uninterrupted fellowship. And I just want you to pay attention to this thought. He says, if only you did this. Why? Because it's good for you. At the heart of this is God's desire to bless them. The motivation that God is displaying is that he wants their best. And he's mourning in this sense because they don't want their best. They're going to choose things that harm them. And he says, if only it wasn't that way. If only it wasn't like that. God allows them to agree to this, knowing in their hearts they won't follow. But it's for their good. We get into chapter 6, and we find what's considered to be the heart of the Hebrew faith. It's called the Shema. You've probably heard that name before. Verses 4 and 5 say, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This concept has a deep theological premise, but if you think about it in a very plain way, it's just the reality we have to live in. It's just like saying, this is my name. This is the air I breathe. This is the world I live in. This is the landscape that we need to exist in, that Yahweh is God. And that he is the only God. And that he's the creator. What does all that mean? What does that mean for me and you? How do we interact with that? Well, it means that we love him. We love him. This word one, right? The Lord, our God, the Lord is one. It means, in Hebrew, one. Pretty good. Paid a lot of money for those Hebrew classes, and they are paying off. It means one. It's a singular concept. So another way you could say this is, he is the only one. The Lord, our God, Yahweh, he's the only God. God is the only one. There is no other creator. There is no other sub-God. There is no other. We have one God. That's important because the temptation for the rest of the Bible will be, but maybe there's someone else. Maybe there's someone who competes with God. Maybe I could be that person. That's the temptation the rest of the time. The Lord your God is one. And what does it look like to know that? That you love him. That you love him with all your heart. All your heart. There's no room for other gods in your heart. It all belongs to him. With all your soul. That is your being. It's yourself. I am a dedicated being to Yahweh. And with all your strength. Meaning I'm undistracted. This is where my efforts go. This is where my pursuit goes. The love he's describing here, it's not the sort of flirtatious butterflies kind of love. It's the love that means commitment. It means faithfulness. It means loyalty. It means allegiance. It means covenant, promise. You are allegiant to this God. You are committed. You're faithful to this God. God would oftentimes, he uses the language of marriage as he describes what it means to be in relationship between Israel and him, the church and him, right? That's an analogy he uses. And there's a commitment that exists in that marriage. There's a faithfulness despite everything else. There's no excuses for breaking that, right? Because it's constant. And the love we are called to is a constant love. Here's what happens when we engage that. When we take this heart of the Old Testament, this faith right here, and we say, I'm going to live by this. Like this really is going to be all my heart and all my soul and all my strength is going to be dedicated to loving. It produces a life of obedience that people notice. It's a type of faith that is loud. It's a type of faith that is present. And he actually points this out. If you look down in 6:20, it says, in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you. In other words, there's going to be these little eyes, and they're going to be watching you, and they're going to say, why are we doing this? Why are we following these things? Why do we keep showing up here? Why do we keep opening that book? Why are we doing this? And the response for the next few verses is him explaining, so what you do is you tell them the story. We were slaves, and God in his kindness rescued us to this life. This is what we were saved from, and this is what we are saved to. And parents, that's our play. Why do we have to keep coming to church? Why do I have to why are you making me learn this? Why do we have to? Well, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about what I'm like without God. Let me tell you what it's like if we're to live without these things. And let me tell you what he's saving us to. Let me show you where we're headed with this. That's not who we are anymore. This is who we are now. And along this line, this testimony is this faithful obedience. That's what we're invited into, to live justly before God, with God. Now, the way I see it, chapters 7, 8, 9, and the first half of 10, Moses leaves that command front and center to love the Lord your God, to follow him. Keep this in mind, follow these decrees, make sure you're faithful, obey, keep your heart set on this. He keeps that centered. And then for these next chapters, he's going to list out all the warnings about what could happen. What's going to pull you away from that? Where are you going to fall down? What are the most obvious traps that lead you into disobedience? In chapter 7, he lists off these influences of sin. He goes down the list and he allows them to he identifies what they will allow to pull them away from God. He says, you're going to leave the door open for sin. You're going to leave the door open for sinful people to influence you. You're going to leave the door open for idolaters to come into your life and steer you away. You're going to leave the door open with lust because you want it. A little bit won't hurt. You're going to leave the door open with greed because what they have looks pretty nice and I really would like more. You're going to leave the door open with fear because you're kind of scared of what the consequences will be if you shut the door on them. And he says you're going to leave the door open and it's going to be awful. One of the reasons in there I find particularly interesting is that he says you're going to allow these people into your life because of pity. And that really struck me because in a general sense, we want to show pity to people who are hurting, people who need help. But there's a difference between showing people who need help pity so that you can help them, and showing people who will not be helped pity so that they can take advantage of you. And what he's saying is there's a difference between maintaining holiness, maintaining open arms at the same time, and then saying, well, I feel kind of bad I'm going to lower the bar of what we're going to call sin so that they feel a little more comfortable. And Christians do this. This is the story of every terrible mainline denomination. Right? And I don't need to bash denominations. Maybe I do a little. All right. So what happens is there becomes a fear. We're dying as a denomination. Our numbers are dropping. How can we fight this off? This is most commonly the fear. It might be numbers in attendance. It might be numbers in money. Occasionally, it's a political pressure, but usually it's those two, where a denomination will then say, you know what? Maybe we're okay with some homosexuality. Just some. We'll just stop saying it's wrong. We won't necessarily say it's wrong. We'll just stop saying it's wrong. Or, you know what, maybe the Word of God, it's good, right? We're good with it. Maybe it's not so powerful. Maybe it doesn't exactly have all the authority. In fact, you know what we could do is we'll just, instead of saying that it's non-authoritative, what we'll do is we'll just kind of stop teaching it. And we begin to lower the bar just so that more people can come in. Gosh, I need to let you know though, like the goal isn't to get the most people in. The goal is to be faithful. The goal is to be faithful. I'm actually going to go ahead and trust God with who he saves. Amen? Yeah, we don't need to be changing what his plan is. It's a pretty good plan. I don't know where I am. We're all lost now. Okay, where are we? Chapter 7. Chapter 8. He gets into these next concepts of what is it that's going to throw you into the ditch. It may be these sinful influences, but also he says, you know what's going to trip you up is that God's going to test you. And that's interesting, isn't it? That one of the dangers we have is that God's going to place tests in our way purposefully. And the first half of chapter 8 is dedicated toward how he tests them through wanting. He tests them through need. He says, you were in the desert and you didn't have food. It's pretty needy. That was a test. He actually calls it a discipline. It's the same word. I'm going to discipline you. I'm going to test you. I'm going to see how strong you are. And he brings them through, and they need to rely on it. I just need you to be clear, because you're going to need to come back to this moment in your head. God will test you with hardship. It doesn't mean he's mean. It doesn't mean that you're the victim. It means that he knows where you need to grow. He knows where you need to grow. So the question becomes, will you still hold him close? Will you still be faithful when things are hard? Will you stay faithful or will you get fearful? That's the test of wanting. In the second half of chapter 8, he leads into this test of having excess. He says, I'm going to test you with giving you what you desire. I'm going to test you by allowing you to be so comfortable you can almost forget how much you need God. I think for most of us, that's where we live. If you look at a global scale, we're doing pretty fine. Everybody here knows that they're going to eat lunch, right? Nobody here is worrying, oh no, we might not get it today. Right? That's not the norm of the world. And it can become a lulling to sleep. Comfort. God says, I will test you. I will test you. Look at what he says in verse 17 and 18. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. It's a test. It's a test. You're gonna want to think, look how great I am doing. All I got to do is strategize a little more. I'm going to leverage this. It'll launch me into that. That'll produce another opportunity. If I can just keep growing at 9% every quarter, I'll be able to. Don't do that. You can actually think through these things and begin to think how special you are. Well, God must love me more. Look at all that I have. I must have figured this out. Found the cheat code. I must actually be maybe one of his favorites. If God has led the way in your life in provision, the response to that is to lead the way in generosity. The question is, will you stay faithful or will you get forgetful? Will you stay faithful or will you get prideful? It's a test. And then from chapters 9 into the first half of 10, he points out that God knows his people will grow self-righteous. This is a huge, huge problem, that they're going to fall into disobedience because they become self-righteous. Listen to Deuteronomy 9. It says, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No. It's on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going in to take possession of the land, but on account of all of the wickedness of these nations, The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. Stiff-necked. You guys know what that means, stiff-necked, right? You've worked with livestock and you're trying to get them to, and they're just stiff, they won't go. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. This is back before hot sticks, so they had to, really stiff-necked people. That's what he leaves them with. Don't you dare claim what God has given in kindness is something that you deserve. Don't you dare mistake his gift as what you've made for yourself. Just to make the point, Moses spends the next 34 verses recounting the failures of Israel. 3 times in those verses we just read, he said, don't think it's because you're righteous. Don't think it's because you're integrity. Don't think it's because you're righteous. In fact, I just want to prove the point real quick. Who was it that built a calf of gold for no reason? That's right. That was you guys. Who was it that tested God in the middle of the desert after he had been providing and you were whining and complaining? Who was that again? Oh, that's right. That was you guys. Who was it that did exactly what God said not to do 100 times in a row? Oh, that was you guys. See, a good friend is going to punch your pride in the gut. That's what Moses is doing here. Imagine if we did this, right? You're feeling all high and mighty about yourself, and we're like, hey, come here, take a seat. We actually made up a PowerPoint of the lowest points in your life. And we just want to remind you, it's just something we can do to help. That's what he does here. Allow me to be a good friend to you. Life doesn't owe you anything. You ever think about that? God doesn't owe us anything. The success that we have experienced, it's not ours to claim as from our power. How would your successes go if God wasn't there with you? They wouldn't. God doesn't owe us anything. And what happens is we begin to trickle in this lie that good things have happened and things are going okay. And it must be because I'm so great. In fact, I am really great. In fact, God owes me because of how great I am. And then when something is taken, something doesn't go the way we want. Well, now I have a right to be angry with God because he owes me. It's untrue. It's a lie we tell ourselves because it makes us feel like God. The successes that we have experienced, the successes Israel experienced, were only because of God's kindness. That's it. There is no such thing as a self-made person. You hear that? Right? If you listen to any of this, the help yourself culture, it's make yourself. You got to work. You got to hustle. You got to be who you're going to. There's no such thing as a self-made person. You know what people do? People destroy themselves. That's what people do. God makes people. God heals people. God fixes broken people. God restores people. People don't do that. We never have. God has probably used you to do some incredible things. Things that leave you deeply satisfied and thankful, and just the gratitude of being able to inform a broken world of something good. And you should feel those things, but not at the expense of pushing God out of the equation. Occasionally, people will come talk to me. They'll be like, oh, that was an incredible sermon, Noah. That just changed my life. It's funny, because sermons are just words, right? And if God doesn't do something with them, it's really nothing. right? And that's the experience you have. You're impacting people's lives. I got a text this week from a guy that I've never met who's apparently been live streaming. Shout out. What's up, dude? And he lives in another state, been live streaming, and the Lord he's like, oh, thank you so much for this teaching. I have this new relationship with Jesus and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I'm thankful. Like, I'll be honest, like, I didn't start the new relationship with Jesus. Like, I didn't, that wasn't me. Like, yeah, okay, here's some Christian dust for you, like, I can't do that. All I can do is be thankful to God for working through me. Like, praise God that happened. But not because of me. Like, God is working, and yet when we choose to avoid that part of the equation, when we leave him out, what we're doing is we're just choosing pride. We're just choosing death instead of life. As we get toward the end of this section, I want to read to you chapter 10, verses 12 through 21. And there's 10 verses here. I want you to think about these. He summarizes everything that has been there in the last chapters in a really interesting way. He just picks out these kind of main points throughout it, and he puts them all together. And I want you to kind of listen for what we've already talked about, and I want you to see where he goes with it. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I'm giving you today for your own good? To the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and loved them. And he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. This connection of everything we've talked about, he says, you need to follow God in faithfulness. You need to obey. You need to have your heart chasing him. You need to be the person that he's designed you to be, pushing out his love into the world. And what's interesting is the why. 17 through 21, he gives the reason why we should stay faithful to his covenant. He says, because God is God, which is a pretty good reason. And then he gives some more. He says, his power. And you're like, yeah, that is good. And his power really overflows and is connected to this justice. And you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then it takes this really interesting turn. All of a sudden, we're talking about orphans. Like, where did that come from? I get the law. I get faithfulness. Okay, I get the distractions. I get God's power. We've talked about all these things. And now all of a sudden he introduces the fatherless and the widows and the foreigners. I just want you to follow my thought here, because I sat with this for a while trying to grasp where Moses is going. Where is he going with this? He goes, God is God. And out of this character is power. And the power is displayed through justice. And justice is never a part of God without mercy. And he says, so for you to be my people, the way you live is to be merciful. God's people are defined in one of the most primary ways as loving. What does God do with all his power, with all his majesty, with all the justice? He finds Israel chained up in Egypt, and he rescues them. What does God do with all his power, with all his might, with all the resources that could possibly exist? Is he works in your life. Mercy. And as people of God, what overflows from us is we find the vulnerable They're there on purpose. And we show them mercy. As we do that, one of the main motivations is we know what it's like to receive mercy when we needed it. Do you know what that feels like? Just think for a moment. When have you been shown mercy? You needed it. And there was no way you could earn your way out of this. There's no way you could, and mercy was given to you. For most of us, it comes in the form of forgiveness. Where we sit back and we realize, I had ruined so much. I was shown mercy. It says that overflows from us to love others. Hearing all of this from God comes down to a choice. It's in verse 26 of chapter 11. I know my slide is wrong, okay? I know it says chapter 10. I don't pay the guy who makes my slides enough. Chapter 11, verse 26. It says, see, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God, I am giving you today. The curse if you disobey the commands of the Lord your God and turn from the way that I commanded you today by following other gods, which you have not known. I think the two choices are obvious. You can choose blessing or you can choose curse. You can choose life or you can choose death. You can choose to follow God or you can choose to ignore it. The choice is there. Now, if you're not familiar with the larger picture of Scripture, you might be getting amped up about all this, right? Back in chapter 7, he's talking, you got to get in there and you got to slay all the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Terabites and the Metabisulfites, and you got to get going. Get in there. Charge. Claim the land. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to live by the promises. But then you keep reading, and you realize through the rest of the story that this law, this Mosaic covenant, right, Moses, the Mosaic covenant, Mosaic promise, was never meant to be the full picture. It's a short-term hope. See, this is your experience with this law. And it's my experience with this law. This is what happens. You read these things where it talks about being merciful, and it talks about living a certain way. And you're like, that makes sense. I like that. I can do that. In fact, that's good. And you sort of swing this way. And you go, yeah, I'm nailing it. I am amazing. Everybody else is messed up. In fact, maybe I can even look down on them because of it. And then as you go, you realize, wait, something's not right. I'm trying to keep these things. I'm trying to do these things. I'm trying to earn these. It's just not, I'm failing. And as you fail, guilt sets in on you. And it begins to swing you to the other side. And your guilt becomes shame. And all of a sudden you realize, like, I actually hate these rules. I hate these things. They tell me how awful I am. They make me feel terrible about myself. They show me how far I am from God. This is awful. This whole law thing's garbage. Let's get rid of this. And it actually becomes this dichotomy that doesn't have to exist. It seems like it's broken because we're broken. This is what Jesus has to say about the law. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Do not think that we need to get rid of it because it isn't working. I'll tell you what, the law is not the problem. Right? You ever hear these arguments? Occasionally one of them will rise to the Supreme Court about some garbage where somebody's like, we just need to get rid of all the laws. It's like, yeah, the laws aren't the problems. It's the people that are the problem. People are the worst. Consecutively, continuously, people are the worst. But we got to love them. We got to love them. In our own hearts, we take what could be good and we use it to hurt ourselves and to hurt others. The law is not the problem. The law is we are broken and therefore we cannot fulfill what we need to. The law proved our brokenness. And that makes us real uncomfortable when you have to stare it in the face and you have to admit that your heart isn't good enough. to do this right. It isn't perfect. But at the same token, it proved Jesus' perfection. When he came, he fulfilled the law. He lived out the law perfectly in a way where it's like, oh, I see now that this displays God's perfection in a way that we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. Why? I'll tell you why. Chapter 10, verse 16 of Deuteronomy. He says, circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. Here's the law. I'm inviting you to obey. Here's a way that you can live that will funnel you into an existence as a nation that makes sense and I can work through. It works. But there's something inside you that's stopping it. If you're an Israelite, you know what circumcision is. If you don't know what circumcision is, ask your mother. And you have this picture where Moses is saying, circumcise your hearts. You're like, what in the world? I have to perform open heart surgery on myself. And that's going to make me less stubborn. Connect the dots here. The problem isn't the law that has too high of a standard. The problem is the brokenness in our hearts leads us to sin every time. We can't do it. We can't use this the way it's been, this Mosaic promise. It can't take us where we need to go because I can't use it the right way. My heart is broken. I need a new heart, which means if I can't use this promise, I need a new promise. So at the end of this, I read through this and I go, I need a new heart and I need a new covenant. I need God to make a way that isn't dependent on the brokenness of my heart to carry me across the finish line. And in Jeremiah 31, if you're to fast forward, God gives us a picture of what that is. He says, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. That's where we are right now, right? We're being led out of Egypt, and he's making this covenant, and they mess it up in the desert, and he's reestablishing it again. He's giving them another shot. And what did they do? Because they broke my covenant. Though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. I was faithful. It didn't break down on my side, but I will make a new promise because you couldn't keep up your side of the deal. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. There's that new heart. I will be their God. Remember that big temptation, how we keep wanting to find another God? And they will be my people, belonging. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sin no more. Jeremiah gives us this picture of what is it going to be like when that promise that is short term brings us to somebody who can fulfill it, and it will actually fix the brokenness. Circumcision of the heart. Circumcision was this sign of the Abrahamic covenant that said, God, I am obedient, I am faithful, I am pure. I'm going to walk with you in this loving, faithful obedience. That's what the sign. And you move into the New Testament, where the church is, that sign is replaced by baptism, where we stand and we declare, God, I am faithful to you and I will walk with you in obedience and in faithfulness and in love and in purity. And what he's saying is that you got the sign going, but what I need is the internal reality to take place. It isn't just this sign that has to say something, it's a reality of your heart that has to change. And we already talked about people don't change their hearts. God changes hearts. People don't make themselves. God makes them. We need a new heart. And we need it from Jesus. Jesus, because of his faithfulness, he completed the law. He did what we couldn't. And now, instead of the law being over top of us, threatening us with this horrible pride of self-righteousness or this horrible hatred of God and ourself and guilt and shame, instead of it being weighted down on us, he uses it to rescue us. He steps into it fully and perfectly. And then in his perfect sacrificial life, allows us to exchange that guilt for his innocence. His life for our life. His death for our death. We have to choose life. Choose life. It's right in front of us. The joy is not that God has, look at this book that God's given us to these helpful rules for living. That's not a joy. That's a punishment. That's a death sentence eventually. The joy is that he forgives us. That his power is coupled with his justice and coupled with his mercy in a way that's perfect and all together. That he's present with us and he gives us a new heart and lives within that new heart. That's the joy. To choose life, though. To turn from the death. To choose the life. If you're not a Christian, you have that choice to choose life, to choose Christ, to choose what it means to be truly blessed. Or you can choose to carry it yourself and try to swing between being prideful and being ashamed, hoping somewhere you can find some balance that will pan out. You can allow Jesus to carry the cross for you, or you can try to pay the payment yourself. No one's going to make you choose, but you will. Choose life. As Christians, what we do here is we take note. We take note of what it looks like to choose life daily. That there's a lot of sin in our own hearts that hasn't been rooted out yet, and it will keep the door open. It will cause us to pull away from choosing life. It will cause us to lean into failures, lean into enticing death. We learn and we watch. And as Moses says again and again and again, be careful. Remember. Watch out. Remember. 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 This is here. Don't forget. Pay attention. Our sin is creeping. It's quiet. We can choose life, though. The other side of this as Christians is we get to focus for a moment on the heart of God displayed here. That he treasures us. That this whole covenant, the whole promise, if you go back to chapter 7, it talks about the promise being made because of love. Because of love. You guys, there's a story that I heard of a kid, and he asked his dad, hey, what's the earth sit on? What's below the earth? What's holding the earth up? And the dad's like, turtles. It's on the back of turtles. Kid thought about that. Well, what's holding up the turtles? He says it's just turtles all the way down. And you look at this and you're like, what is holding us up? What is holding us together? What is this promise made of? And you look and Moses says it's God's love. And it's just his love all the way down. All the way down. The further you think about him choosing people, him showing mercy, him delivering justice, him providing, him testing, it's just love. To know that Jesus shows up out of love should inspire, engage, it should encourage and empower us to choose life. To choose life. Treasuring Jesus even more.